So we're ready, and I'm going to do something a little bit different this session to mark the end of the year, the beginning of a new year, and that is to um, reflect on some of the most important things that happened in the last year. Not to go in depth on one, but to try to cover several topics at the same time. And um, I want to do it by asking the question 50 or 100 years from now, assuming there are still humans and historians on the planet, what will they be paying attention to as the most important things that happened in 2023, or the things that we should be anticipating in 2024 as being the most significant? And I have a few different things on the board here. As you can see, the grisly, awful images from the Hamas attack on Israel, the utter devastation of the Israeli campaign in Gaza. This is from the summer of this year, those terrible wildfires in Canada that blanketed much of North America in incredibly dangerous particulate matter smog. This is the view of Manhattan from Brooklyn, basically choked out by the amount of smog in the air. And then I've got another couple of images. Biden's abysmal approval rating and the fact that inflation came under control in the United States, at least in 2023, apparently. And the idea being, in a sense, that I think the big images here are the things that might actually capture the attention of historians 50 years from now, be historically significant, and maybe some of the stuff that we've been more focused on will fade in importance when we're no longer in the midst of it. So I have four questions I'm going to try to answer today. Hopefully, I'll be able to get through all of it. The first is, was 2023 the year humans lost control of AI? And I think of this as having a few different dimensions to it. One of them is the technology itself, and 2023 is the first year that AI technology became directly available to average consumers on their handheld devices, on their computers, and many of us started using it directly. And I'm not sure how many of us today are actually using chatbot GPT or Bard or the other available interfaces. I rarely use it, just playing around to see how it works, really, but I know that most of my students are using it. And I think it will be one of these generational divide issues where, if you're probably 40 or younger, the likelihood that you're using AI already or will be using it on a regular basis for everyday tasks has grown substantially in 2023 because it's become available to everyone. But in addition to the availability, I think it's important to recognize the leaps it's made in terms of its problem solving capacity. One way to recognize this is just to ask, how is ChatGPT doing at tests? And as you can see, this is a version from earlier in 2023. This is the most recent version. And on some of these tests, like the bar exam, but also the GRE verbal or the SAT reading, it has, in a sense, matured from maybe the capacity of a 15-year-old to the capacity of a 25-year-old law school graduate. By the way, not on this exam, on this table is the fact that a artificial intelligence program has now also passed the USMLE. So the artificial intelligence can get into college, can get into graduate school, can get a law degree, can get a medical degree. It is phenomenally intelligent. And that's just the tip of the iceberg for what this technology can do. Among the other things, and this is the cartoon from the New Yorker meant to capture this, it can also have a pretty good semblance of human intersubjectivity, including apparently reacting with emotion, appropriate emotion, when told the right story. So if this is the year that this technology really got out of the box, um, are we going to be able to control it? And I will just review material that we've talked about together before to give you a sense of what we're looking at with AI, where it's going, what its promises are, and what some of the concerns we should have with it are as well. So we have now generative artificial intelligence that generates its own original content in language, in song, in images, in artistic work that appears to be painted in photographs, and this is not merely copying, not merely modifying or replicating. It is clearly derived from what we do, but nevertheless its capacity for constructing new patterns makes what it does derivative, but nevertheless original. Karl Marx once said he didn't have a single original idea. It was just the way he combined them. And I think that's true for many of the most creative people in the world. And generative AI perhaps is now beginning to have that kind of capacity for creation as well. It's also machine learning technology. And so, to be as clear as possible, the kinds of artificial intelligence we're talking about are not programmed by us. They are designed, engineered by us, but they learn for themselves. They learn from detecting their mistakes and going back and correcting those mistakes, and oftentimes it's one artificial intelligence program correcting the mistakes of another artificial intelligence program. Humans are not involved in the learning. And this is because we've had these breakthroughs in sub symbolic dispersed neural network computing. That's a little technical. I probably won't get into that unless you want me to. But to put it in much simpler terms, we have something that is akin to the complexity of the human brain created in a silicon environment inside chips and computers that now seems to be developing some of the capacities for reasoning and problem solving that the human brain has, and without some of the limitations of the human brain, including our limited memory, our limited speed for processing information. And the result is, on the one hand, these very rapid breakthroughs. It used to be that a breakthrough occurred every 25 years or once a decade. Now it's practically every year or multiple breakthroughs a year. And the result is also that artificial intelligence is increasingly at least as good as we are at some of the tasks that we regard as being essential accomplishments of human intelligence: language production, writing, for instance, Shakespearean sonnets that are actually quite good. Any form of poetry you ask it to write, it can very quickly, a second or two, crank out a poem about your preferred topic, and it is a quite good poem. It may not be Shakespeare, it may not be revolutionizing the expressive vocabulary of the human language or the kinds of resources we have for revealing the world of our emotions, but it is good poetry. The military applications have been particularly apparent in the war in the Ukraine. The medical use, right? The idea that when a medical diagnostic image is created, it's now typically read by artificial intelligence. And because AI can compare it with hundreds of thousands of other similar images, in a minute or two. The diagnostic reliability of AI is much greater than even that of a really well trained and experienced human technician. I think is quite remarkable. Having said all of that, it's not yet general intelligence. Each of these applications of AI is a niche program, right? It's a program that is able to read a medical image, but not drive a car, not produce a poem. And the thing about human beings is we're able to do all that, cook dinner and take care of our kids all at the same time, right? That's because we have general intelligence. We have intelligence across multiple domains. That is not where artificial intelligence is yet. And super intelligence, exceeding our intelligence, right? That we use ourselves as the metric to measure what how intelligent the machines are on some applications. For instance, equation solving, uh, or internet and commercial use, um, or reading these medical images, the computational power of artificial intelligence exceeds our intelligence. But what we don't have yet is super general intelligence, artificial intelligence that are more intelligent than we are across all the domains of intelligence. And that's important because we really don't know if we will be able to control artificial, super general intelligence when it occurs. And we don't know if its intentions or purposes will align with ours, be compatible with ours. And so we don't know whether we're creating something that ultimately we won't be able to control and could possibly be hostile to or indifferent to our interests. And if you would have asked computer scientists 30 years ago, well, is it possible that there will be general super intelligence? They would have said, well, yeah, it's possible, but you've got 150 years. This is not an urgent problem. You ask computer scientists today, most of them think certainly by the end of the century, but maybe by the middle of the century. And those who are more radical think maybe within even a decade. And so what used to be a kind of distant science fiction scenario now appears to be quite likely. And so we've talked about this before. Again, Jeffrey Hinton, who is formerly of Google and the godfather of the kind of artificial intelligence, this sub-symbolic dispersed neural network computing that has produced all these phenomenal results over the last decade. And he just this year quit Google in order to be able to share publicly his concerns about what Google and other companies are doing with the technology that he laid the foundations for. And he thinks that what they're doing is a profound risk to our humanity and society, right? And very quickly, there are clear and tremendous potential benefits from this technology, right? Including the fact that it's solved one of the most important problems in microbiology, being able to map protein sequences in 3 dimensions, which is going to drive really significant medical breakthroughs in the coming decade for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's treatments, for targeted cancer treatment. And by the way, we're about to start talking about climate change. The hope is that artificial intelligence will also be able to help us do things like decarbonize the atmosphere efficiently, assuming that that's possible to do. And it's just technological or problem solving impediments that are in the way right now. But having said all of that, in evaluating whether the benefits are worth the risks, we have to consider how substantial the risks are. And at this point, it does appear that this is predictably unpredictable disruptive technology. And so people who look at this think that 30 to 40% of the work currently done by human beings is going to be transformed or eliminated by this technology, maybe in the next decade. This is already starting to happen. And so that's a profound economic earthquake, and it's not entirely clear what will replace those lost jobs. In addition to that, this internal ethics advisory panel to Microsoft and Google issued these reports warning that employing this technology commercially, making it available to everyone, could flood the internet with disinformation, degrade critical thinking, erode the factual foundation of modern society. Let me make a quick prediction for 2024 that at some point in the election cycle, probably quite close to the actual election, there will be deep fake videos circulating. For instance, Joe Biden confessing that he was enriched by Hunter Biden's criminal activity in the Ukraine, that Donald Trump was right the whole time, and he's so happy that he got away with it, right? It's not going to be real, but it's going to be impossible to tell that it's fake in a timely fashion, right? And so this is the kind of worry. It's not just hallucinations, it's not just bad information, it's the malicious use of this technology by bad actors because the technology is so powerful. And of course, despite the advisor board saying don't do it, Microsoft and Google did it because OpenAI was doing it and they didn't want to fall behind one of their competitors. There is also, according to the experts, a 10% chance that this technology will cause human extinction or permanent and severe disempowerment of our species. And so I just point out to you that we need to be thinking about regulating this technology while we still can. And frankly, the whole model of regulation is going to have to be different than the kinds of regulations that we've used in the past. One of the stories I love here is that we knew about how effective safety belts were at saving lives in automobile accidents 20 years before we actually required automobile makers to install them in their cars. They lobbied to resist this. And this model, the government is over here trying to regulate, the industry is over here resisting the regulation, is not going to work for this technology. It evolves so quickly, it will have lapped the regulators 5 times before the regulators are able to impose regulations that no longer address the cutting edge problems. So there needs to be a collaborative model of regulation. Please note that there are baby steps in this direction. You had the leaders of these large AI companies going to Washington this summer and in essence saying, please regulate us, which is a peculiar scenario if you think about it for a moment. But by the way, don't regulate us in ways that prevent us from competing commercially. And I think that's where the real difficulty is going to be in getting the industry to be transparent and actually forthcoming to talk with the regulators and government about where they're going, what they anticipate the next development in this technology will be, and what kind of regulations might help to address the dangers while allowing us to reap the benefits. And so there need to be incentives for the companies to be transparent and cooperative with regulators. I'll just say very quickly, another thing that happened in 2023 that seems relevant to AI is that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and the Surgeon General of the United States issued a report on the health crisis among young people in the United States, especially girls, related to the use of social media technology. And I'm not sure whether you can see, but this is a kind of aggregate listing of different indications of poor mental health among girls and young women in the US from 2001 to 2018. And what you can see is that these different uh, aspects of poor mental health went up and down, usually in response to economic cycles, perhaps some randomness, for the decade before Facebook was employed. But in 2012, when Facebook hits the social media universe, becomes available on your smartphone, on your computer, look at what happens, right? A sharp upward trend moving basically in one direction. And this is clearly what seems to be driving this, right? The prevalence of the use of social media technology is directly correlated with anxiety and suicide. And what I'm trying to suggest by looking at this, and this is further data, right, about the way in which the people who use social media in their teens and when they're young adults are sleeping significantly less, a couple hours less a night. That may be driving a fair bit of this, but they're also being bullied. They've got greater body image problems, anxiety, depression, loneliness. And my point is that when people develop, right, computers and our smartphones, nobody thought that the dominant use of this technology would be for social media. It's really hard to predict where new technology is going to take us. But I think we should anticipate that the artificial intelligence we're employing right now is going to take us new places. All right, so question number two. I start with a basic empirical observation. 2023 was the hottest year ever recorded in modern human history. Going back to the ice cores, it looks like it's been hundreds of thousands of years since we've had a year this hot. This is the month by month data going from the beginning of the 20th century to the current year. And it compares the months of the year with the average temperature for the 20th century. And I don't know if you can see this, but I find this fascinating. The last month that was colder than the average month for the 20th century was February of 1979. Since then, we've been on this sharp upward trajectory, and in particular, July, August of 2023 were the hottest months ever recorded. They were miserable to live through. And as you can see, this is not just a step jump. This is a big jump. And it raises the question, is climate change accelerating? Despite all the alarmism that we have been subject to for the last 20 years about this topic, is it perhaps the case that it's worse than we imagined? And so very briefly to refresh your memory, right? We have two periods of climate change over the last 150 years. Starting with the Industrial Revolution, we have the slow increase in temperature from the 1880s to the 1960s. And then beginning in the 1970s, the temperature increase really steps up. One of the things that's driving this is the vast increase in human population that takes hold in the middle of the 20th century. We go from having 1 billion to having 4 billion to having 8 billion human beings on the planet, exponential population growth. And by the way, we are wearing more clothes, eating more meat, driving more cars, flying more planes, and so our civilization is carbon intensive, and that means that the amount of heat trapping gas being put into the atmosphere increases as well. This diagram shows you what's contributing to this. Greenhouse gas emissions is the largest, the single most important event forcing climate change to occur. And you can see here that it is offset somewhat by aerosol production, which actually puts reflective material into the clouds. This has been better appreciated just recently. And by the way, we're starting to reduce aerosol emissions due to international treaties that might, though it's awfully good for our lungs because aerosols are bad pollutants and do damage to the lungs, be bad for climate change. There are other human forcing events like deforesting, building cities out of concrete and asphalt. And then there are natural forcings. And I want you to focus on this for a second to see the pattern, right? And the pattern is one of up and down, right? Sometimes nature is increasing the heat of the planet. Sometimes it's actually decreasing. This tends to be cyclical. One of the big cycles that I want to point to, and I know you're familiar with, is the El Nino weather pattern, right? Which is really driven by an ocean current pattern and then by the prevailing winds that come off the oceans and how much cooling air they carry or not. And I want you to see a couple things about what's going on in the oceans. The first is that 2023, again, record year for the surface ocean temperature, and not just a record. Look at how far above it is the recent average, 1991 to 2020. You can see all the lines indicating all those years, and then see that by the time we get to the spring of 2023 and El Nino is taking hold, we have exceeded the hottest year on record considerably. And the reason for this, and again, I want you to appreciate what is going on as best possible. Look at the amount of warming in the atmosphere, right? That's the red or orange line there at the bottom. And please note that it's actually a very small amount of warming, especially relative to what's going on in the ocean, right? And the question here, the oceans obviously cover 2/3 of the surface of the planet. They are miles deep in places. They have done us a tremendous favor by absorbing all of this heat for us. Um,
Double.
uh,
Yeah, turn that off.
Let me see. I'm just going to mute everyone. By all means, I'm going fast through a lot of topics. Whenever you have a comment, please feel free to unmute yourself or to raise your hand. I'm happy to be discussing this with you. I'm just trying to cover everything in the limited time. So the oceans have this capacity to conduct the heat from the surface to the depths. As a result, they've absorbed much more heat than the rest of the planet. And one question that we don't know the answer to, I want to be as clear as possible. This is just at this point speculation and worry. Have the oceans, in a sense, reached their capacity? Are they saturated? And are they therefore starting to emit much more heat back into the atmosphere? And if so, will they stop doing us this huge favor that they've done us for the last 50 years? And will climate change start to accelerate? The last diagram, just to appreciate for a moment, is a diagram of projections of the temperature of the ocean made by climate models. And this is an average of 40 different, the best, the most reliable climate change models. And please note that July 2023 is a little bit above the average, but basically within the range predicted by these climate change models. And then note where these climate change models predict ocean temperature is going. And I'll just say as clearly as possible, when a model predicts reasonably well, you are well served to take seriously its future predictions. And the future predictions here are catastrophic, right? And so we need to really regard 2023 as a wake-up call, an alarm bell about accelerating climate change. We are within zero point zero 0.07 degrees of that 1.5 Celsius threshold. There's nothing magical. We shouldn't fetishize that number, but that is the degree of temperature increase that global climate change scientists believe results in a 50% chance of catastrophic ecosystem failure. And this year, we got inching very close to it. So, to the good news, and I want to be as clear as possible, there is good news on climate change in 2023, including what came out of Dubai at COP28, the UN International Climate Change Conference this year that wrapped up just a month ago. Among the things that happened, the pledge to transition away from fossil fuels. And this may sound peculiar to be celebrating. Haven't we known that for a long time? But it's the first time there was a consensus. And since this is an accord, right, every country has to agree. And the fact that the conference was headed by a CEO of a major oil producer may actually have worked to get greater consensus on the idea, yes, fossil fuel is a major problem and we need to be reducing it. Now, having said that, that's incredibly vague. And the experience in the past has been these conferences are places where the leaders of the world get together and say they're going to take climate change seriously. And then they go back home and basically don't do what they say they were going to do. And so one of the questions is the not just elevated temperature, but the fact that we are experiencing more and more extreme weather, more and more fires, floods, droughts, hurricanes, making it such that there's going to be increased urgency in domestic politics around addressing climate change. Again, future historians will have to wait to answer that question. Two other accomplishments of COP28. One of them, and I think this is important, a deal worked out in advance by the United States, the European Union, and China to commit to tripling the world's renewable energy generation capacity by 2030. And please note how ambitious that is, both in terms of the amount, 3 times as much, and in terms of the time frame within the next 6 years. I'll say more about that in just a moment, but the final thing to note is the funding of the loss and damage fund. And the thing to note here, right, that for over a decade, Europe and the United States have been saying to the less developed countries of the world, you are not really responsible for climate change. Our industrialization is the thing that's really driven the emissions that are trapping the heat. You do not have the resources to cope with its consequences, and yet you are on the front lines. It's hitting you harder in sub-Saharan Africa, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, etc., than it is elsewhere in the world. We will assist you. But that's been mainly an empty pledge. At this most recent COP, the loss and damage fund was finally vested, $800 million. That's a little bit more than the Dodgers just agreed to pay a pitcher for a decade. So obviously insufficient, obviously not up to the scale of the problem, but at least the beginning. Now, going back to that idea of tripling renewable energies sources within the next 6 years, let me note what makes this possible, right? And that is that solar energy, which used to be the most expensive form of energy in the world, 2009, is now the cheapest form of energy in the world. If we combine the cost with the efficiency of generating electricity from these sources, as you can see, onshore wind and solar have become the most efficient, affordable sources of energy in the world. The cost of lithium ion batteries has also plummeted, making electrical vehicles much more affordable. And by the way, what's driven these reductions in costs and these increases in efficiency is in large part breakthroughs that have been funded through government subsidies, subsidies by Europe, by China, by the US. I've got the data on the US here. And please note that with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, many more subsidies and incentives are going to industry. And so I do think, in addition to the fact that today we're reaping the rewards from policies that were implemented 15 years ago that subsidize the research and innovation that now drives renewable energy sources, we should anticipate that another 10, 15 years from now, there will be further major breakthroughs and that this will become easier. Another way to put this is when solar becomes 90% cheaper, the resistance to implementing it probably goes down by a similar ratio. The big question will be here: did we do enough and in a timely fashion, or did we wait too long? And again, future historians will have to address that. There is a near scientific consensus now that really we have already emitted enough or already committed to emitting enough greenhouse gases that we're going to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. One of the big questions will be, can we pull some of that carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere at some point in the future? Will we develop the technology that allows us to do that at scale and in an affordable way? One more aspect to this, and this is just to broaden this out, please note that of the environmental and planetary vulnerabilities that we face in the 21st century, climate change is not the worst of them. And so I do think one of the big questions we have to ask is, are we currently able to get our heads around the idea that we now live in a vulnerable world and that we, the species, are the source of that vulnerability, and that requires that we take much greater responsibility for shepherding the planet in ways that preserve its capacity to sustain life, including our own lives. Question number 3: was 2023 the beginning of the end of the era of modern liberal democracy, especially in the United States? And I want to set this up by reviewing with you information we've looked at before. If we're looking at whether or not societies are democratizing, moving in the direction of electoral and liberal democracy, or instead autocratizing, moving in the direction of electoral autocracy or full closed tyranny, as you can see, the trend has been in the wrong direction. In 2002, more countries were democratizing. In 2022, many more countries are autocratizing. The result is that the proportion of the Earth's population living in free societies has decreased by more than 50%. The proportion of the Earth's population living in partly free societies has more than doubled over the last 20 years. This is in part because there is rot in central democratic institutions in the public sphere, in which we're increasingly sealed in information systems that confirm only what we want to believe and that suggest that anybody who believes something else is despicable and deplorable. We have political institutions that are really non responsive to average citizens, only responsive to people with a lot of wealth or organized interest groups. And across the globe in democracies, we have conservative parties that are becoming increasingly populistic, autocratic, nationalistic, anti institutional. And this is, at least in the eyes of certain political scientists, perhaps the most dangerous development for democratic societies when their conservative parties start to turn against democracy. When they are elected, they tend not to relinquish power, but instead to undermine democracy. At the same time that our central institutions are failing, the problems that they have to manage are mounting, right? And I'll point out that one of the things really driving this is the extent of immigration internationally and the sense that immigration is changing the ethnic and cultural composition of different societies in ways that the indigenous members of the society do not like, that it is straining the resources, undermining the commitments in terms of welfare and benefits to the indigenous citizens. And this is pushing people in an illiberal direction. We don't like those liberal internationalists who are opening the floodgates to all of this migration. I will just point out that the reasons the migrant flood is mounting is not because of liberal immigration policies. I would challenge you to point to many nations in the world that have liberal immigration policies now. It's because of economic inequality. These people can come to these richer countries and do the same work that they would do at home and earn twice or four times as much in more humane conditions. It's because of economic or political instability in their own countries, making it dangerous for them to remain there. And it will increasingly be because of climate change, also rendering their domestic societies uninhabitable. In addition to that, our institutions are struggling to manage rapid cultural change, right? And here I use American examples, the idea that we have many more irreligious or agnostic citizens, that we have many more transgender youths, that women are increasingly resisting traditional gender roles. How do we cope with this legislatively? And I don't want to say that this is per se a problem, but I do want to say that if we were better at coping with migration, and now I'm going to add inequality, right? And so on the one hand, to go back to some of the previous ideas, we have a higher share of our population foreign born. We in the United States are well on our way to becoming a majority minority society. We have these absolutely stunning levels of inequality in our society, with the top 10% of our population taking more than two-thirds of the wealth, the bottom 50% getting less than 3% of the wealth. This means essentially they have on average about $400 in savings. And here I'm sharing a little bit of research from Branko Milanovich's recent work, where he describes what he calls the curse of wealth. And his idea essentially is that as societies get richer, they become more unequal unless government actively counteracts the rising inequality. And these books suggest quite to the contrary. Our politics have been so paralyzed, our legislatures so inept at coping with this, that economic policy making has transferred to the Federal Reserve or central banks, and that they are engines of inequality. So there's a tight connection between the failure of democracy, the rise of inequality. The rise of inequality presents a problem that a democracy already struggling has a harder time addressing. And then we've got a feedback loop: greater inequality, greater political dysfunction, greater inequality. I will just point out that this is especially true in the United States, and that's where I'm going to focus for the next couple minutes in terms of the Republican Party. And I'm going to look first at the fact that the Republican Party has become not only racially, but ideologically homogenous. The number of conservatives in the Republican Party, three quarters. The percentage of liberals, a negligible 4%. Please note that the American people are much more heterogeneous or diverse, as is the Democratic Party. A ideologically homogenous party has a hard time governing. It does not like compromise. It wants to have its core principles implemented. One sign of this, among the things that we'll see in 2023, Congress was taken over, the House of Representatives, by the Republicans. We all remember the spectacle of uh, Speaker McCarthy first taking 15 votes to get the speakership, and then being the first speaker in the history of the House to be ousted in a vote, and one of the shortest lived speakers of all time. If you want a reference, there's Nancy Pelosi, who was speaker for nearly 3,000 days. McCarthy was speaker for less than 300 days. But it's not just the instability in the leadership that shows the Republican Party is having a hard time governing. This is data on the amount of legislation passed. And as you can see, the enacted legislation so far in the 118th Congress is less than any of the recent Congresses. And these are not productive Congresses, but there's been almost no legislating. 27 bills passed, almost all of them are passed via incorporation. And so we have legislative paralysis at the same time we have all of these problems that we need to address politically. And then let's add that we are on the cusp of a presidential election, and one of the two likely candidates, obviously I'm talking about Donald Trump, is facing 91 separate felony counts in four different cases. The intersection of trials and a presidential campaign, completely unprecedented in American history. And I just want to be briefly attentive to the fact that among the issues that our legal system is going to have to address is whether or not Donald Trump is even qualified to be on the ballot in 2024. Obviously, Colorado and Maine have concluded, given what it says in the 14th Amendment, Section 3, that Donald Trump aided or participated in an insurrection after having taken a pledge to uphold the Constitution, and therefore, by the clear language of that amendment, he is barred from ever again serving as an official of the federal government. And therefore, he should not be on the ballot. The Supreme Court will certainly have to hear this case, and it puts the Supreme Court in an incredibly difficult position. On the one hand, the clear language of the amendment seems to bar Trump. On the other hand, we don't want 9 unelected officials, almost all of whom have not Ivy League degrees, deciding the outcome of our election over the objections of a third or 40% of the American population, right? And so a real strain on American democracy and the rule of law in 2023, 2024. And please note, right, again, that the Republican Party, in other circumstances, you might hope that the party would simply say, okay, we can't have this man representing us. He is disqualified, if not constitutionally, at least by the fact that he's likely to be on criminal trial while the election is taking place, and maybe even be convicted before votes are cast. And yet, as opposed to that, the Republican Party is denying that Trump is being prosecuted in accord with the law, and rank and file Republicans seem to be mainly persuaded by their party that the reason that Trump is facing prosecution is because he stands up for ordinary people. I just think this is a tremendous risk to our political and legal system to have these intersecting forces colliding in the middle of a presidential election. Fourth and final question. We see the wars unfolding in the Ukraine and in Gaza. We tend not to see the wars unfolding in the Sudan, in Yemen, and in over 40 other places in the world because our media pays almost no attention to them. But war is clearly on the rise in 2023 and in the third decade of the 21st century. Does this indicate that the institutions of international order are frayed and breaking down and no longer able to contain and prevent war? And I will suggest to you that I think there are good signs that this is happening, and that the events of 2023 are accelerating our return to international anarchy. One way to look at the international order and to begin to question it is to look at its distributional effects. The United States, the architect and anchor of that order, also happens to be the chief beneficiary of the global economy, the chief emitter of greenhouse gases. And when we look at whether or not the world disapproves of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine the way that we do, we see no, actually, the majority of the population of the world is governed by governments that did not vote to condemn Russia. By the way, I think the intersection of the war in the Ukraine and the Gazan war and the perceived inconsistency or hypocrisy of the American government strongly condemning the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and arming the Ukrainians to resist themselves, when it turns out that the number of civilians killed in 30 days in Gaza, and please note that it's probably double these figures now that this war has gone on for a second month and is into its third month, right, is far more than the number of civilians killed or injured in the Ukraine. And yet, not only has the United States mainly blocked condemnation of Israel, it has in fact armed Israel, provided them with the weapons that are killing civilians much faster in Gaza than in the Ukraine. And I don't want to suggest an equivalence and apples to apples comparison between Gaza and the Ukraine. Obviously, Hamas aggressed against Israel and did brutal, awful things to Israelis. But I think from the perspective of much of the rest of the world, the positions of the United States in these two wars are hard to reconcile. And it underlines or reinforces the conclusion that the United States doesn't really believe in a principled international order. It just uses these principles to accomplish what it wants to do, right? And so we are in the midst of escalating warfare, escalating civilian deaths in both Gaza and the Ukraine. You probably saw the terrible bombardment of the Ukraine that happened yesterday. And I worry, right? Not that I'm a huge fan of everything the United States has done in its foreign policy over the last 50 years, but let us note, right, that we have not had a great power war since World War II, that the number of people dying in warfare has gone down dramatically since the end of the Cold War, that these might be the accomplishments of what we might call Pax Americana, American peace, in containing military ethno-national aggression. And as Robert Kagan notes in the title of one of his recent books, when that order declines, the jungle grows back, warfare goes up. And I really do worry with modern technology. What we know is that these wars can be incredibly destructive. We have been the beneficiaries for the last 50 years of an order that restrained killing. Is that order beginning to come to an end? Will that be another of the big factors that his future historians notice about 2023? All right, so those are my four big questions. I'm sure you must have questions also. Who wants to start us out today? All right, Flossie, take us away. Unmute yourself, please.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. I'm dreaming
Me
of
too.
a new leader, man or woman. I'm trying to imagine who that person might be. It is a kind of belief in the impossible, but there has to be someone who can say the right thing, not so much do it, but say it, have the right language to lead us out of the inhumanity that now surrounds us. I am imagining who that leader might be. I don't know why I am putting my hopes in someone like Jack Smith. I may be off my rocker.
You're dreaming of a white knight, not a white Christmas, right? And I'll just point out in this regard, In 2016, when Donald Trump was elected president, he was the oldest person ever elected to that office. And of course, 8 years later, he's running for that office again, and he's the younger of the two leading candidates for that office. One of the things it seems we need is some new leadership, right? And hopefully, I do think generational change often produces progress. Hopefully, we will soon enough have generational change in our leadership. I'm not sure we're going to get it in 2014 and 2024. I lost a decade there. Thank you, Flossie. And by the way, I don't know if you saw, I'm looking out my window when you say you're dreaming of a white Christmas. Here it is, December 30th in New York, and we haven't had a flake of snow yet. It was almost 60 degrees yesterday. I'm not complaining too loudly about that, but I do worry about what it says about climate change. All right, anybody else with a hope for 2024 or a question about the answer to the 4 questions I posed, right? AI, climate change, the decline of liberal democracy, the decline of international order, the resumption of war. Anybody want to come in on any one of those topics? Genevieve, we need you to sing Imagine. No, she's not gonna bail us out today. Anybody else?
Well, you could just say, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you do. Only hell below us.
Yes.
Lucy, can you say, imagine all the people living for today? Lucy, say, ooh, ooh.
Ah,
Oh,
there's Lucy.
Genevieve has a background chorus. That's very.
Yeah. David.
And unfortunately, she's only concerned with Frozen.
Okay. Well, there's songs from that too, I know. Anne, did you have your hand up a moment ago?
I did. I just, as usual, how do we keep our hopes up? I mean, it's all these things are not happy. They're not happy things.
Well, I tried to build in some of the good news with climate change, right?
I know.
And I think one of the things that reveals, and I'll point out 2 things. I don't know if you followed COP28 as it was unfolding, but there was so much outrage that it was being led essentially by an oil sheik. And lo and behold, he got them to do what nobody else could get them to do, which was to say, we got this terrible bleeding wound. Let's put a bandage on it. Let's actually acknowledge that it's fossil fuel that is the problem here. And I think that's an important breakthrough. So the idea that we have made progress on one of these fronts indicates, I think, that we can make progress if we can actually muster the political resolve and make our institutions operate in the way that they're supposed to. So I am of course a political philosopher. My inclination is to think that the impediment and the solution is both political, and so I'm not optimistic about 2023, 2024. I'm cautiously hopeful about our capacity to rebuild our institutions and to get better at solving these problems, because these problems are going to be unrelenting until we do, right?
Yeah.
That's part of what the temperature change, the growth in extreme weather shows, is if we put our heads in the sand about this, if we let the oil industry pull the rug over our faces, we're not going to, the wool over our eyes, sorry, we're not going to be able to address these problems. So there's a little bit of a ground for optimism about our ability to react as the problems start to mount. David, you've got your hand up as well. Thank you for the question, Anne. Do you have something you wanted to say in follow-up? No. Okay. Go ahead.
Over the last year and a half, I've become a fan of a younger philosopher, I guess political philosopher, Sasha Monk, and
Yes.
he has a blog called Persuasion, which I read religiously, not fanatically religiously, but religiously. And I can't remember the name of the guest blogger he had about 3 months ago, but he had an essay on the ills of our society, and he made the point that we've evolved to the point where we take positions, we take sides rather than positions. And and by taking sides first and positions second, our conversations are inherently ideological, and it's hard to talk to one another. And his point was that we should take positions, not sides. And that if we take a position, then we're obligated to provide evidence and warrants to support it. And that's different from beginning by taking sides and just declaring that the other side is inherently wrong. So that's one of the things that I'm going to try to resolve to do in 2024 is rather than just starting off with the assumption that the other side is inherently wrong, start off by making an argument for what I believe to be both valid and true.
Thank you, David. And I'm going to just point out the name is Yasha Munk, I believe, if we're talking about the same person. And let me see, I've got a couple of his books around here if I can find them.
He's got a new one that just came out, and I haven't got it yet, but a friend of mine just read it and highly recommended it.
Yeah. The great experiment is, to my knowledge, and I do think highly of him. I'm going to point out in terms of what you got from his blog that I think really important thing about taking positions, making arguments, raising substantive claims in politics is it implicitly commits you to hearing arguments from others as well, from to evaluating their positions, right? If you are making an argument, you are implicitly claiming my position is a good position. And the only way you can validate that claim is by hearing the other position and then providing an argument, evidence to the conclusion that your position is actually the better position of the two. And doing that involves not just then having a position, but evaluating the positions of others, and doing that fairly, impartially, with an open mind involves also acknowledging the possibility that you don't have a monopoly on insight, truth, or reason, that maybe the other side has some good arguments too. And I really am focused on this in some of my own thinking, the idea that democracy only works when we hear the other side. It only works to get us better policies, but also to manifest respect for each other as equal citizens when we are willing to listen to each other. If I simply insist, I know I'm right, and I don't even need to hear the other side, I'm no longer really living up to my duty of civility, my duty to fellow citizens, to hear and hear. Go ahead, David.
Well, another way to express it is that what we want the result of conversations to be is dialogue rather than one monologue after another. And I think that the serial monologue is where people talk past one another and they don't engage with the other person's ideas.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. I think that might be a good aspiration to conclude on. Maybe 2024 is a year in which we can start trying to do better, to hear the other side, to engage in dialogue, to not just take positions, but to actually present arguments behind proposals for change. Wouldn't it be a better year? All right, everybody. Wonderful being with you. I'm going to wish everybody a very happy, healthy, and successful new year. And I look forward to seeing you next Saturday in 2024. And by the way, don't forget to look at Genevieve's window. You see it?
Yeah, there's
We've
Lucy.
got a guest along today. Who is that, Genevieve?
Lucy, say
Hi,
Happy New
Lucy.
Year.
Happy New Year, Lucy. Lucy,
Hey, we got a smile.
do you like Frozen? You ever heard of Frozen?
Olaf.
Yeah, good. Well, enjoy, everybody.
Happy New
Take
Year,
care.
everyone.
Happy New
Happy
Year.
New Year.
Bye.
Bye, guys.